You know, science is awesome for deer. Science has come a long ways when it comes to managing deer herds, parcels, but at the same time, science can be very misleading, and that's the nature of science, especially when it comes to deer and deer management. For example, there's a lot of things that happen on giant parcels because there's no model of deer management that actually takes into account small segmented parcels like most of us hunt in private land areas, even small public land areas, and the buck movements, doe movements, how they relate to each other, how they relate to hunters. Everything's done on a very large scale, and it has to be for science. A lot of the science relates to the management of giant deer parcels and hunting parcels. I'll choose this hat.
I didn't even notice. Hat break.
Yeah, hat break. You guys probably don't even recognize me without a hat, so I'm Jeff. I have my hat on now, so felt naked all of a sudden. And so anyways, but a lot of the science just is not applicable to you, the hunter, and it's not that the science is bad, it just doesn't apply to your situation. And so we're going to go through some of these, and the reason I want to talk about these is because then you can take them back and, you know, how does this science actually apply to you, your situation, where you hunt on public land, give you maybe some better perspective so you can have a greater understanding of not only the deer that are there, how to hunt those deer, how to manage your own property, but how the state or government agencies manage as a whole, which could be different than your needs, but it's based on completely different amount of science or a type of science than that actually applies to you. First one, enclosure cages. And what I'm talking about is you're putting a cage out on a food plot and you're looking at it and saying, wow, the food on the inside of the cage is 2 feet tall and it's down to the dirt on the outside. The simple way to look at that, and we want you to use your head a little bit more in this exercise, I guess, or these topics. The simple way to look at it is there's too many deer. And I even had my father-in-law, Greg. He was the state up in Wisconsin was telling him, well, your food plots are down to the dirt. You need to shoot a bunch of does. He's in an area in Wisconsin, up in the Hayward area, very sandy soil. There's no ag fields, very few food plots around him, any type of good food, a lot of pine. And so his food plots, there's about, let's say there's 8 of them. They're really small. They total about 1.1 acres. He simply doesn't have enough, even with a very low deer population around him, to ever have food unless he cages it in some way going into the hunting season. That's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean there's too many deer for the area. In fact, it'd be terrible for him to shoot a bunch of does and get rid of a bunch of deer because there's, quote, too many deer. It's just that he's not planting enough for the situation. And we see that a lot. We see that in ag fields. We see that, for example, around here, let's say you had an average deer herd. The owners before us had about 5 acres in beans. They were down to the dirt by October. Those beans are spread out into several food plots across a couple miles. And it's just not enough food around here to last once things start turning brown and the weeds start dying going into the fall. So it was an unrealistic expectation for the number of deer in the area and the local food. When I was in the UP of Michigan, I had about 8.5 acres of food plots. Most of those food plots were down to the dirt by middle of November, end of November. They still had a little bit of a draw at the end of November, early December, but some of those years, the deer were leaving the deer yards and they were migrating off to the property. I had about 1/3 as many deer there as we hunted down in Wisconsin, where I hunt now and where I used to hunt starting 2002. Yet 6 acres of plots down in Wisconsin, even with 3 times as many deer, lasted appreciably till February, March, and we always had some food standing. And it was just because they had the complement of the ag. They had better habitat in general with better stem count, briars, lots of daytime browse. That's another thing. If the deer don't have much to munch on during the day in their bedding areas, then they hit whatever food sources they do hit in the afternoon or at night a lot harder. So there's so many complexities to figure out when you talk about an enclosure cage, other than just there's more food in the cage, so we need to thin the deer herd. That would be very inaccurate and actually bad deer management, even though it's good science. Because if you do know the exact number of deer in the area and the exact amount of food you have, you can use an enclosure cage to compare and contrast from each year to each year, and you might see that you have more or less food standing, depending on the year, and that might be an indication of taking more does or not in a very large area, very large setting where everything's stable and everything's the same. But when you have 40 acres, 80 acres, you don't know what your neighbors are doing, you have 200 acres, 400 acres, 500 acres, it becomes a lot more complex. You need to look at a lot more factors than just A equals A. There A equals many different choices when it comes to exposure cages. Number 2, population estimates. A lot of those estimates are based on corn piles in August and September, and you take a census, and then that's telling your population model, and you can compare and contrast from year to year. The problem is in August, September, in most areas, the deer herd that is a huntable deer herd, for one, it's not a time where you can actually hunt these deer and control the population, so you should never take a population at that time. But 2, if you have a great property, you'll have a lot more deer in October, November, December. If you have a bad property, you'll have a lot fewer deer in October, November, December, and most parcels are not managed well, let's face it. And so you'll have fewer deer the more you hunt going into December. So when you take a population model in August, September, even if you compare and contrast year to year, it's a very inaccurate measurement because you don't know it's a pivot point. You don't know what happens. On the flip side, I've seen population models, Mississippi, famous deer manager down there, he looked at a client property of mine, it was about 500 acres, and it was full of deer in February. He made a recommendation of shooting 50 does and fawns each year until they got the population under control. A landowner did that, and they couldn't shoot 50, but they shot as many as they could, 30 the first year, 25 the second, 18 the third year. By the time they were getting up in the 7th and 8th year, they were having trouble seeing a deer. And this is under the recommendation of a, quote, professional. Population model timing was considerably off. In fact, my client, I was down there, what's going on with this? This is what we were told. Population should have been taken in October, November, December, not February when all the deer were migrating onto his parcel because of clear cuts or whatever it might be in the middle of the winter time from miles and miles around. That'd be no different than going into the UP of Michigan or northern settings where there's deer yards and looking at the deer yards and say this is the population that's representative of this area, when the deer are only there from January to March and not at all the rest of the year. So too early, too late is a very bad thing. And how that applies to you, you need to look at what's going on in October, November, especially late October, November. That is your huntable herd. That is your controllable herd on private land. And that's really what matters most. That's what really, when it really counts as to what your numbers truly are. And then you can compare and contrast that from year to year. But before the season, after, very bad science, except in large controlled acreages. I'm thinking of ranches that have thousands of acres down in Texas, big southern lease land and commercial forestry properties, or public land where everything's generally the same. Your neighbors aren't doing different things because you don't have neighbors. You have a checkerboard pattern of management and timber management across thousands of acres, so everything's constant. Then you might get a reflective, but I'll throw in a little wrench in all of that. The mature bucks hit the bait a lot less, and you can come up with formulas that take into account the fact that mature bucks will hit the corn fewer or less frequent than younger deer or does and fawns, younger bucks. But how accurate is that model if you never know exactly what's not hitting the bait because they don't hit it? So very, very hard. It gives you a very big window of inaccuracy. Buck movement. This one I've talked about a lot before, but all the buck population models are over long commercial forestry, public land, federal land, state land entities where they can put a collar on a deer and they can find that it moves miles this way, miles that way. That gets shrunk down considerably in well-managed private land areas that are a lot smaller or even poorly managed. And what ends up happening is if a buck survives, it's because he moves very little during the daylight and he has consistent areas that he stays in. And we notice around here, and I'm talking southeast Minnesota, southwest Wisconsin, we see this in clients all the way across the Midwest, upper Midwest. But when we see small parcels, for example, here in Minnesota, we're separated by about a 250-yard field, and then our neighbors on the other side of that field, they have about 80% of their bucks, 70% that we never see, and vice versa. They just don't cross that field. And this is what we have 40-some cameras out, so we know when we see a buck. And it's not to say we get every buck, But on a well-managed parcel, and this is something different too, on a well-managed parcel, you have very few surprise bucks. Very few surprise bucks. Let me repeat that. You have very few surprise bucks. You should know 95% of your bucks going into a season. When your property is managed poorly, you're going to see a lot more surprises because you don't have those bucks that choose to live on your land a large percentage of the time during the daylight, and you have hunting pressure that's being applied too much, your land is designed poorly, and so when that happens, deer are kicked off your land, and you're not going to see those bucks in a normal setting as if you manage very strategically and you manage for daylight buck holding cover. So it's a really big difference between the two. The more poorly managed a property is, the more random bucks you'll see, and the better you manage your land, the fewer random buck sightings you'll see, to the point where you should know at least 90%. You have to hit that 90% range, you're doing a really good job. But a lot of these population estimates and buck movement estimates are over huge areas. Talked to John Azoga, I've had a lot of personal conversations with, that you can't quote me on, but the gist of it is I said, how come there's no population models? This is back in the late 90s, early 2000s. How come there's no buck movement that takes into account small parcels? And he said it's impossible to actually create a study like that would pass the scrutiny and peer review unless it was hundreds of parcels in many different areas over 10 years or more with tens of millions of dollars. It's something that could never happen. Never. You're not going to get all these people coordinated in all these different states and areas to watch these population models of very small parcels. And I'll give you an example. You can have one person move into the neighborhood. Neighborhood meaning within 2 miles in any direction. They have a great habitat and food plot program, and they'll draw deer just in 1 year away from all the neighbors. The neighbors will think, wow, DNR gave out too many doe permits last year. Do we have wolves in the area? Where are all the deer going? Did they all die? Did they all get EHD? Did they all get CWD? No, you just had one person that knows what they're doing move into the neighborhood, and it drastically altered the deer movement in just one season. And that happens too. So what is applicable to large property, and again, the state feds, they have to manage that way. That's all they have, but that doesn't apply to you. Mature bucks, what does that mean for you? It means that on small parcels, you can mature bucks in most areas, almost the entire season, 90% of the time, will move less than 200 to 300 yards during the daylight. Who cares if they have a 3-mile home range at night? You're managing for the daylight only. If you keep that in mind when you manage, then you can throw all the studies out the window, because you can successfully manage a deer herd, even if you use part of your neighbors as supporting cover, depending on which side of the property you have the least amount of pressure on. But bottom line is you don't need much to control a lot, and that's the cool thing about deer management if you kind of ignore the science of the big buck movements. 4, browse surveys. Just simple. You look at an area and cedar swamp. All the cedar is going to be eaten up to our head height. You look at pines, typically non-browsable species, even something that's almost starvation food like beech brush. But if you look at that next to a giant food plot where there's a lot of deer during the wintertime because there's crops standing still, or an ag field, it'll give you the impression that there's too many deer. And people say, well, in completing this browse survey, we find that you have too many deer. Well, it's February, you had hardly any deer in October, November. Again, wrong population, wrong time, and the survey doesn't mean anything, because deer with poorly planted or traditionally poor browse species, those browse species will be hammered next to food sources, especially during the winter time when deer are congregating due to the lack of food. Doesn't mean there's too many deer in any way, especially because they're browsing on a certain species. It just means that they're yarding in that location, or they're herding up during the winter, and they're hitting what's available, and they'll eat anything. We have a really cool video recently of a 10-point that is eating, looks like, were those white oak leaves or red oak leaves, Dylan? If it's eating leaves of some kind, it's sucking them off the snow. They're not that nutritional, but it's what's there on top of the snow, and they'll eat just about anything if it's near their bedding area and near the area that they're hanging out. Doe movement, long range. This is interesting. We were having a QDMA, it's NDA now, but it was QDMA meeting back in 2005, 2004. We had a district wildlife biologist who's mostly into grouse, to be fair, But I was talking about does, how the same does would live 200 yards away from the food plot every single day, probably 100 yards on the same hump. And they'd be there every single day, and you could control that movement. And it was pretty cool, even in the UP of Michigan. He stood up and he said, oh, that's not possible. You know, does have a movement of 10 miles, 12 miles. Well, he was referring to the science of John Azoga, Lou Verm. John Azoga was sitting in the room, and John said, no, that's not correct. That takes into migrating and yarding characteristics during the wintertime, where deer will migrate 5 or 6 miles or more to a deer yard to hang out all winter. That is not applicable to doe movement during the fall, during daylight hours, and even nighttime areas where does have about 20% the home range than a mature buck would or less. So you can really control, if you don't spook out that food, if you have good cover, if you have screening around the food, you can pack those does tightly into your property, which leaves open acres behind that in more remote settings on your property for bucks. So don't ever believe that does move in a long range, but that's an example of using the science to lie. The science lies, and this person that said that didn't even understand that. He didn't understand the study and the parameters of that study, and that's what's really hard to apply those to small parcels. Jawbone aging, this is a tough one. Dylan, I'm hoping you can find, I think you can find this footage, but I'm talking about Barry. Barry lost his antlers the 18th and 19th. Last year, Barry was a giant stud. I have some pictures of him where he is truly a 5-year-old stud with big antlers. And then this year we have he lost him December 18th, 19th. We're not sure what's going on, but we have a few mature bucks limping. And he was one of them that started limping that we saw on November 19th. He was gone for a couple months. He came back, he's limping bad. Well, he's obviously stressed. His body size went down. And that's a buck, and I know we're talking about jaws, but I'll just use this as an example, where you look at the body and the body lies. And we have some video right now where he's feeding in the middle of the day on a green plot, and he looks like he's a year and a half. He looks like a button buck because he's so thin, he's so worn out, he has already lost his antlers. It looks like just little bumps in his head. We know it's Barry because of his limping. We know it's him. We know the area. He's not moving very far. And when it comes to jawbone aging, it's one way that scientists can compare and contrast across major landscapes, but jawbone aging lies. And we have a chart that's from the QDMA back in the day with 250 some known age bucks. And you can see at 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, 5.5, 6.5-year-old bucks, the window of accuracy went down to 18% correct at a 5, 6-year-old buck. Really, really bad looking at the jawbone. It's within a year or two on a 3 or 4-year-old buck, but the average, looking at that, and these are 5 research biologists, so they're not people that just do this for the fun of it. It's, you know, on a once a day or one day during the entire year on opening day of gun season or something. These are biologists that do this for a living. And even sending the teeth off to the lab, you can see how inaccurate that was too. So Dylan, I assume you have that chart somewhere, but it was a chart not made by us. But the point is that jawbone aging can be extremely, extremely misleading. And a lot of times, of course, whether it's the body or the jawbone, in a regular setting where we're not watching these deer on some sendero with corn spread on it or a giant food plot down in the south in commercial property, we can't watch these deer for more than 10 seconds before taking a shot. So they're coming through. We can't jawbone age them, obviously. The body can be very misleading. We have big bucks, small bucks, short bucks, long bucks, no different than we as people and humans. But bottom line is it can be very misleading. So we like to focus on the antlers, the gait, the maturity, the look of that buck when it's coming through. Certainly we want to see that bigger chest, if it has a big belly. There's a lot of things you need to take into account in about 3 seconds or less. And so antlers, although they're not scientific, it's hard to compare from one to the other. I'm not sure that they're actually that worse than jawbones. Jawbones are really bad. Around here we can look at a 1.5-year-old buck with antlers and say that's a 1.5-year-old buck. We can look at an older buck and say that's an older buck, 4+. Who cares if he's 7 or 4? He's a mature buck. Then we can look at him at 2 and 3 and tell exactly, you know, within really good percentage of accuracy what the age is. So think about that when it comes to jawbone aging, even sending your teeth off. It's not that accurate. It's only a way that scientists can compare and contrast over a large body of work, which probably doesn't have much to do with your small parcel and the way that you hunt. Shoot does everywhere. It's always good to take a doe here and there, right? Wrong. There are a lot of areas where the population's low for various reasons. There's many reasons the population can be low. I look at where we hunt out in Pennsylvania. The population is very low in those hills. Should there ever be a doe shot? I'm not saying there should never be a doe shot, but most seasons there shouldn't be. Yet they are. A lot of our farmland, ag land, people need to shoot more does. The point is, it's hard to send out and to actually have permits that come out that are applicable to every area. So we have deer management areas and deer management units, and you break them down by that. But even across that, these are huge wooded parcels here. These are big ag parcels. Ag parcels have more deer in general. The wooded parcels have fewer. The wooded areas get hit with the same number of deer permits, even though they're just 4 miles away from the ag area. And the ag area has a lot of deer. All of a sudden, there's hardly any deer here. There's a lot of deer here. I hope that makes sense. There's way more to it than you have to shoot a doe everywhere. And then that brings me to, you're a good steward if you shoot a doe. And I've seen that people post they just shot 2, 3, 4 does and they're standing over them. What's the giant picture? Because very, very few people that say, well, I'm going to go out and shoot some does because we need to, actually look at the population and know from year to year. We had in our Wisconsin property, we had that property for 12 years. There were several years we shot 0 does. There were several years we shot 5 or 6, 1 or 2. And then there was one year we shot 12, another year we shot 9. We shot 9 in one day, but it depended on the year. And just because we shot a doe didn't make us good stewards. We could be doing it all wrong, and a lot of people are. So you have to make an educated decision. And a lot of times on public land, you shoot a doe, you really are. We have areas up along the Lake Superior shoreline that have less than 3 deer per square mile. Think about that. And miles, there's miles of no deer. And so those areas aren't going to have deer again until overpopulated areas allow deer to move into those areas. So when you go up there and you shoot a doe with your bow because you can, not only are you not a good steward, you're really doing damage to the local deer herd. There's areas like that. There's areas even in ag land because of lots of permits around here. This is a whole nother video, but they're starting their sharpshooting again. They're baiting on properties. It's all kind of hush-hush. You don't hear about it because they give meetings that are 3 days ahead of time, and if you go to the meetings, you find out about it, but most people don't even know there's a meeting going on. But bottom line is, they're starting in February. They're baiting. It's all for CWD and herd monitoring, which I'm all, for herd monitoring. That's great. We need to see what's going on with this. But imagine all these deer that are attracted to giant corn piles. Like around here, it was negative temperatures last night, negative 10, negative 15, actual temperatures, not wind chill. Deer are traveling a long ways, miles, to get to these giant corn piles. And the longer they have them out there, in which they let them sit for a while, then those deer flock to them, they herd up around them, and then they go up under the cover of darkness with suppressors and they shoot them. Well, they don't shoot all the deer. Obviously, when you shoot a few, some start to run. Well, then they go back several miles to the areas they came from, and in theory, if you had the piles out, which is illegal to do for hunters, and it spreads CWD at that piles, which is why it's illegal to do for hunters, then those deer go back to where they came from several miles away, and they just spread the CWD over there. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. But just because you're shooting does, just because you think you need to reduce the herd, doesn't mean it's a good thing. In fact, you could be doing the opposite. There's a whole lot more. We talk about doe populations, when you should shoot, when you shouldn't shoot, and when it's a good idea to shoot or not. I've gone through years where I've shot 9 personally on one property. And I don't like to talk about it a lot, just for the fact that just because I shoot does shouldn't put a label on me that I either did a bad thing or a good thing. A lot of people don't realize when they shoot does or when they don't, a lot of people don't shoot enough, then they're doing more harm than good, whether they shoot does or not. Number 9, mature bucks, small parcels. Kind of what this boils down to. A lot of people buy their properties because they just want to do their best. And unless you apply a lot of mature buck strategy to a small parcel, then there's no amount of science, there's no amount of habitat work that can make up for how you actually hunt the land for those mature bucks. And that's the big problem with all of this. The old QDMA model, it's still the same model for quality deer management, was appropriate sex ratios, populations maintained within the balance of the habitat, meaning that one habitat could have 5 times more deer than this habitat. And then adequate buck age structure. The adequate buck age structure and sex ratios are the tough ones, because if you're hunting poorly, you don't have older bucks, and you spook a lot of older bucks off the property, so you have a poor ratio of does to bucks. But it's because you don't have the habitat, it's because you don't have the food, and it's because you don't align it properly to allow you to get on and off the property without spooking this deer herd. And that's a big problem. That's a lower hole in the bucket than all of those combined, because if you don't manage for the strategy of a mature buck and how they like to have very small areas that they move within deer and daylight the majority of the season. If you don't understand that, you don't understand how to keep them on their property, which is why we're so busy with clients. Because a lot of people buy property, they spend tens of thousands on habitat improvement, let alone the property to buy in the first place. They buy all the latest gear and gadgets. They follow the science. They're a member of this organization or that organization. However, if they don't manage their property as if there's a high level of strategy for mature bucks, then it's all for naught. They waste a lot of money. We had a recent video out on deer distractors, things that people get distracted on, when really you have that structure of deer management that helps you get to that quality deer management goal of balance. That's all it is balance. What's the older age structure? Well, maybe you have a bunch of kids hunting on the property and you have friends. Well, then your age structure is going to be less. That still doesn't mean you can't do a good job or that you can't have the property set up. It's all relative. The bottom line is that's what determines if you're going to have good property or not, how it's hunted, how your habitat management features are strung together to allow you to hunt. And hopefully you follow this channel because we talk about that a lot. My How to Design a Deer Parcel web class is a huge hit. We get a lot of people that purchase that because it helps when we go through the framework of how we're looking at a property when we go to it. As a group, we'll go to over 300 parcels this year around the country in a couple dozen states or more. The bottom line is that's what we do for a living. We try to bring that to you. And number 10, one of the things that makes me sad a lot when I see parcels is government, quote, wildlife recommendations or programs. We've seen it I won't even list any, just other than CRP, bad timber management practices, where people say this is best for wildlife, when really it's leading you down a path of futility. You'll never attain your wildlife goals or even come close because, again, it boils down to strategy, edge, how you work that edge, food sources, browse. I even had people on the distractions comments. They talk about all the apple trees on their property and how deer love them. Yeah, deer love them, but you can't build a property on apple trees. You can build a property on browse, hardwood regeneration, meaning hardwood growth, young hardwood growth, woody shrub tips, briars. That's what deer need during the day, during in their browse areas, from October to March. Apples are a complement to that. Acorns are a complement to that, but they're not the end-all, be-all. And the more you focus on some of those distractions, the more you draw yourself away from the true potential that you have on your land, the true value of your land, and ultimately what you can do for yourself for building a quality herd and a quality hunt. So a lot of these government programs, unless the person running that program has a history of shooting the older bucks in the neighborhood and making smart choices for decades when it comes to deer hunting, and they have that proven success, then I wouldn't follow it. I wouldn't follow them because they're going to lead you down a path of futility. Interesting, we have MFL programs in Wisconsin, and they are good for people. I'm not saying they're bad in general. I had a recent MFL plan writer in the middle of Wisconsin, and he told me on his land, in his family land, he wouldn't actually have MFL, his property enrolled in MFL, because it was too constricting. And I'm not saying there isn't a fit for it. What I am saying is there are places where it's not a fit and it's going to hurt you compared to your wildlife goals ultimately on the property of where you need to have diversity and edge. So think about some of these right here. They're all good practices, especially on large public land areas, populations. But when you look at science, the more you look at science, the more it's going to be misleading for small parcels. And one parcel here could vary drastically for needs with a parcel just 2 miles away. So I hope this helps you look through each one of these and really balance your decisions this year. And ultimately, we just want you to have a good hunt, a good herd, good wildlife, great edge, great diversity, and do it in a way on your parcel that allows you to actually move on and off your property without spooking all the wildlife that you're trying to attract on your land. I appreciate you guys watching the YouTube channel, but I don't know if everyone knows everything that we have to offer, whether it's on whitetailhabitatsolutions.com, our website, or WHS Wildlife Blends, our seed company. Also Instagram you can check out. I'm very active on Instagram, putting strategies on there, photos of what we do every day. Much more active there than Facebook. But our seed, web classes, books, clients, articles. I have over 600 articles on whitetailhabitatsolutions.com, everything whitetail strategy. Of course, we have hats on there, and then make sure to check us out on Instagram again. But lots of stuff to offer. We're always coming out with new things, and this isn't the end of it. We have more things coming soon. Make sure to check us out.